Welcome, everyone. My name is Jana DeCristofaro, and I'm the Community Response Program Coordinator here at the Dougy Center. I'm also the host of our podcast, Grief Out Loud. As part of Portraits of Courage, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Tashel Bordere. Dr. Bordere is an assistant professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Science at the University of Missouri, and her research focuses on Black youth affected by grief, gun violence, and race-based trauma. Statistics show us that people of color are being disproportionately affected, not only by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also by rates of homicide and rates of gun violence. And while many of us can relate to our grief going unacknowledged or being disregarded, Black youth and youth with marginalized identities, for them, their grief not only goes unacknowledged, but is often penalized and punished. The result is a concept that Dr. Bordere has identified as suffocated grief. Dr. Bordere, thank you so much for joining me to talk about your research today.
Thank you so much for having me, Jana.
And this is the first time that we've talked since you were a guest on Grief Out Loud earlier this year, which honestly feels like a decade ago now. And I'm really looking forward to sharing with our guests and our supporters how we can be putting your findings and your research directly into practice, and also how we can be pushing to change the systems that not only don't support, but punish the normal grief reactions of Black youth and youth of color. So, Tashel, let's start with you. What's your personal connection to working with grieving youth?
So my personal connection to working with grieving youth is that as a youth myself, was exposed to violence in the community. I grew up in the city of New Orleans, which continues to have one of the highest violent death rates in the country. Um, so witnessing, being privy to the pervasive violence in communities and deaths, and concerns about lack of support that support that was available, and supports that were missing, right? That people were doing their best, but there were a lot of other supports that were not accessible to these youth, in a culture that believes in pushing forward and moving through adversity without pausing to take care so we can better move through adversity. And then secondly, I would also say kind of a pivotal experience for me with grief and youth is was just also in spiritual communities, watching the ways in which in Black communities in particular, loss was dealt with, and again in the Black community in particular, relying on spirituality and other types of things, sense of community to be able to deal with hard experiences.
And your research really focuses on the ways in which grief shows up for Black youth and youth of other marginalized identities, but also in the ways in which society and our culture responds to them in their grief. And you've coined this term suffocated grief and talked about how the normal reactions of Black youth often get punished or penalized in some way. And at the Dougy Center, one of our commitments and our educational goals is to validate and normalize grief reactions. So what would you say is vital for us and other folks like the Dougy Center that are working to support kids in their grief? Like, what do we need to know and what do we need to be putting into practice to really show up for these kids in their grief?
Okay. You all are actually doing exceptional at one of the things I recommend, and that's just ongoing education and training by people who are doing research and collaborations between researchers and practitioners and clinicians. Like I use work from Dougy Center to inform my work, right, in practice, and then similarly through programs like Grief Out Loud, you all provide opportunities for those collaborations to occur. And as a bereavement center in particular, I think it's central for you all to make sure that other populations, like the Dougy Center is a very influential bereavement center, right? Organization, and so your ability to model that for other people is huge. So that is one thing, right? And so making sure information is accessible, that's key to socially just practice, is making sure that other people have access to Grief Out Loud to hear me speak and to hear other people speak about the experiences of youth in general and then marginalized youth in particular. And then another thing that I might recommend is making sure that this information is shared in educational systems, right? With people who work with other entities who work directly with bereaved youth, so that teachers also have information about suffocated grief and simple ways in which they might also be supportive and facilitate the grief of youth through very through various curriculum in the classrooms without creating new standards, but taking advantage of the tools they already have in schools to give students a chance to address loss, and that they're more conscious of what it is so that students are not being penalized. I might mention one more thing, and that is to be open to evolving knowledge. That oftentimes we're in a hurry to like get this information, and as you probably know, talking to people who are actually bereaved, there are primary sources. Something else the Dougy Center does well. In a lot of your materials, the information comes directly from your youth. Like they help put together your tip sheets. Their right, the grieving rights are expressed by them, and so doing the same thing, extending that to many different populations. We can't reach everybody, but as you in a quest to reach a more diverse group of youth, making sure their voices are also a part of it, that their images are on bereavement material so that they see themselves as people who are experiencing grief and whose grief matters, and that is recognized in a culture that may not recognize it, and that they're also a part of a community that they may not have felt that they felt a sense of belongingness to. So simple things like stepping back for a minute, reflecting and listening, and not being as quick to want to go in and just fix things before we have enough knowledge, and being open to that.
Yeah, and how important it is to hear directly from the people who are experiencing
Absolutely.
not only their grief, but also what is it like to access services, and what are people needing, what's not there for them. And when I hear the term suffocated grief, or I think about the idea of someone's normal grief reaction being punished or penalized, I have a particular image that comes to mind. I'm wondering, could you share an example of what this looks like?
Yes, yes, it's painful to watch actually, because I don't want to say most times people are doing their best, to be quite frank. Most people are not trained in bereavement. We live in a thanatophobic society, and it's normal it is actually unfortunately normal for behavior to be misinterpreted, even in love relationships, right? There are all kind of there's people can misinterpret things. So it's but I was recently in a school before COVID, and I watched this kid be kind of ushered around the school all day long. Clearly, this beautiful black male child, and he would, he knew that a part of his day was just to spend it in the office. It was a middle school student, so I watched him just be, walk back and forth and interact with people in the office, and I thought this child is missing out on math and science, and while it may not come across as an overt penalty he clearly had some struggles in his life. And I think they did their best to try to, interact with him in friendly type ways, or, tough love type ways. But the truth is, he still needed to learn math and science and English. He's at a disadvantage while he's in these other spaces. And it was a daily thing for him to do this. And so that was actually a form of, it doesn't look like punishment in the sense of, or penalty in the sense of, him being put in a safe seat or anything, but he was not engaged he was at school to learn and to be supported, maybe opportunities while he's in a writing class to talk about what's bothering him today, or what's bothering him in his community, things he wanted to see change. Did he step over a deceased body on his way to school? Is there a memorial planted on his walk to school? Like, what are all of the other ways in which we could have kept him engaged while supporting whatever he was dealing with? Because having him in the office and walk the halls with the principal, or whatever the case was not healing. It was kind of a prison to pipeline behavior, right? And so, although I would argue that, I would think that these individuals would argue that they were trying to support him. And so this isn't a critique, but it's more of an observation, and a way in which we might kind of rethink some of our strategies so that we have a win-win. Students who are being engaged in their experiences, we need him in math and science and English and writing, right? So his whole life structure can be open to him. And so these type of, I wanted to provide more of a well-meaning penalty, because, there are the other ones like being put in a safe seat or expelled or suspended, which underrepresented youth are disproportionately suspended and expelled for similar behaviors. As youth who are youth of racial privilege.
Yeah, and behaviors that get labeled as
Yes.
being angry or being contradictory or not following directions, and not being labeled or identified as having roots in an experience of loss or an experience of trauma or an experience of grief, and how needing to shift that so that we ask ourselves or ask the question or ask the child, like, what's happening? What's going on? That's creating a challenge where it's hard to sit still or hard to listen or hard to follow directions.
Absolutely. I want to say one quick thing about this is that youth in general get stereotyped, right? And stigmatized by adults, right? We think that they overreact. So it doesn't help that people already tend to stigmatize teenagers as overreactive or know-it-alls and all of these. They don't know what we know. And while there's a grain of truth to that, we've lived longer, so that makes sense, right? But these are also normal developmental processes, but they get misconstrued even further when people have stereotypical images or really don't view marginalized youth, or youth from lower SES class, lower SES, whatever the racial group is, or gender males as more aggressive, particularly black males. Then that also just leads to even greater misconceptions about their behavior, because we end up dehumanizing them, right? We don't see them. To see a behavior as different is to dehumanize a person, and most people don't want to participate in that, right? So increasing self-awareness of our own stereotypes and ideas, and trying to better understand child development and what's normal, and then what's normal in grief, right? It's normal to be fidgety. It's normal to be distracted. How did you feel when you were last experiencing a loss? Our teens are charged and our children are charged with they have these similar emotions, just even more intensely than we do, quite frankly, and often for a longer period. So being aware of that alone can help.
It makes me think too, Tashel, about current context, of like
Yeah.
COVID-19 pandemic, uprisings against police brutality, the death of Black icons like Chadwick Boseman, and how grief, you mentioned like having an awareness of grief and how it's so much more in a lot of people's radars, and people are able to say, oh, I kind of get what this grief feels like because I can't concentrate and I can't sleep and I can't eat and I just feel sort of listless, or I feel restless, or any of those things. And I'm wondering, with the youth that you work with, what do you feel, or what are you seeing as kind of the most critical issues coming to the surface now in the current context of everything that's happening?
With youth, their awareness is increasing around these issues in ways that some adults may not anticipate. So through TikTok and Instagram, we're seeing kind of their own uprising and their own quest to have information. They really want information about what's going on. We have a group of youth who are Gen X. These Gen Xers are different, right? Just like every cohort is. So they are much more interested. I'm seeing conflicts like friendship loss at a time where peer support is really central in adolescence, for example. So we are seeing disagreements. So more as things are brought more to the forefront, youth are challenged to also engage in similar conversations that adults are having on Facebook, and battles about, things related to politics, things related to the uprisings with police. They are even COVID. They're looking at and examining on through Instagram and TikTok. Right, they're being educated and informed about national and international issues through social media. And so, and they are concerned about their own safety, right? They are concerned about these. We have youth who are participating in protests right now of all backgrounds, right? And they're experiencing additional trauma in some cases in their quest to behaviorally grieve or form, or as survivors or as allies surrounding the inequities that are more visible right now, and the lack of a sense of safety that marginalized youth have historically felt intergenerationally, and then are worried about right now. I know some parents who won't even allow their children to get a driver's license because they don't want to see their children be at greater risk for harm.
You mentioned too peer support and how important that is, and how it's getting limited in the COVID-19 pandemic world that we're living in right now. And I'm wondering, what do you see as the power of peer support, specifically when it comes to supporting youth who are experiencing grief, and the youth in particular that you work with?
Peer support is huge. In particular, it is always important, right? And peer support is huge throughout development, but particularly in adolescence and later school age kids and middle schoolers. What peer support really helps youth and adults alike, right? Feel less isolated, understand that they're not alone in their experiences, that there are people who also share in the experiences of isolation, of sadness, of anger, that it helps to normalize experience when you see somebody who looks like you, or whether it's in being an adolescent, that variable, or who is the same gender or same sexuality, same race, as well as being in circles where you see people who are different from you also feel a sense of anger or sadness about a larger issue like COVID, or a larger issue like inequities. Teenagers in particular are very worried about what people think about them, right? And so they might withhold a lot of things, right? Across development, younger children tend to withhold a lot because they fear what peers will think. And so it helps, it is as I would say, it's even more valuable to hear this from a peer, to receive some sense of, to feel some sense of unity and sameness, while feeling unique, right? While being unique, but understanding that some of these experiences and feelings are universal, right? When they're shared by people who both have similar characteristics, but also people who have dissimilar characteristics. And that might be even more vital, right? In a society where we're taught to be so divisive, right, on issues, to see that other people outside of your experience can look at it and say, that sucks, or that's really unfortunate. Like, I can see why you're angry. I'm angry too, right? You deserve to feel safe when you walk around the community, right? You deserve to have that be honored by populations of, around us. People are social mirrors, right? And, you can feel beautiful, but if you walk out of the door and people are looking at you sideways, then you might question your beauty, right? Or you might question your grief. And so to have people be around you as mirrors to say, that happened with me too, or something similar. And what you feel matters, right? There are all these movements now, like Black Lives Matter, my feelings matter, like, and all of these are just representations and desires for validation that this thing happened to me. And, do you care that this thing happened to me? It's hard for me it's hard for me to see people in pain, right? And so basically that's part of the question. Are you okay with seeing me in pain? Like, as a part of your humanity, are you okay with that? And so being around people who help our youth stay in the race, right? And I want to come back really quickly to Kobe Bryant and people like Chadwick Boseman, who were very visible in the media. They're not necessarily peers, but to adolescents, but they are symbols of hope, right? They are symbols of courage for our youth. So when we think about the things that youth are dealing with amidst a lot of adversity around them, youth tend to feel, one benefit of adolescence, they tend to feel like they can do extraordinary things, and they can, right? Even when there are true limitations that they should be thinking about. And so we can capitalize on that right now by, the commonality between Chadwick Boseman and Kobe Bryant is that they both had a sense of purpose, that they both worked through adversity, that they both had this just incredible sense of determination. They worked through great pain to achieve the things that they wanted to accomplish, again, amidst all of this adversity. And so I think that even at a time of loss, they remain a legacy for youth across backgrounds for what purpose looks like, and how to have a sense of purpose through loss, and how to advocate for yourself and for other people, even when nobody else is looking, as a part of your own self-healing and growth and development and survival and resilience.
I think about that in our groups for kids and teens, and how they look across, well, they used to look across the circle, and now they look across the computer screen since we're doing virtual groups. When they look across and they hear someone else say something and they say, yeah, exactly, me too, that happened to me, that's exactly how my family's responding. Or they say, that's so different than how my family is responding. And then there's an opportunity in hearing a different experience to help clarify what they understand about their own experience and what they value and what maybe they appreciate about what's happening or what they want to start seeking or asking for. So I think about that with that power of peer support. And I just think about the conversations that I get to have, you and I having this conversation today, the other conversations that we have with professionals and Grief Out Loud. And that feels like peer support for me to say, oh, you're doing the work, that's what you're experiencing, or I'm doing the work, this is what I'm experiencing. So just really appreciating our time of being a little peer support group of two today. And, thinking of everything that's happening, the current context, how your work has likely been changed with the pandemic, what's giving you hope right now?
Oh, so many images of hope. Chadwick Boseman's death, his life prior to his death, how he lived with purpose. What's giving me hope is just the conversations that are occurring nationally and internationally. The conversations, I'm a qualitative researcher, but so I spend a lot of time just talking to people, like communities inform my work and vice versa. And seeing, educators again, unsung heroes, first frontline workers, in addition to physicians, seeing people do their best. The other thing that I know as a developmentalist and a person who studies culture is I know that it takes time for cultures to change, right? People tend to go back to what they know when they're stressed out, when they're dealing with hard things, right? And so the things that are giving me hope, is watching children be okay, work through online learning, watching teachers have to switch gears and to try to do it as seamlessly as possible. What gives me hope is you all being able to to discuss the number of people who are asking for information around loss and bereavement in general, never mind issues that relate to marginalization and support. So a lot of these different things are giving me hope in my work. Just the more conversations that are occurring in our communities at so many different levels, even the conflicts that I see are giving me hope. Right? Because when people engage in these dialogues, just like you mentioned with adolescents and peer groups, you get to hear another perspective that you had not considered. And whether you change yours right now for the better, it helps you see humanity differently when you're more aware of things, of pain and suffering that maybe you didn't know existed before because you weren't in those spaces. So the conversations, the struggles, all of those things give me hope. My students give me hope, right? My 3-year-old gives me hope, who tries hard every day to do her best without seeing other little people her size right now. So those things keep me moving forward in my work, watching people wake up every day and do their best amid COVID, the pandemic. All of these things give me hope.
I really appreciate that because I think of that every single time I sign on for one of our virtual support groups and people pop up in the waiting room like, dee, someone's here for group. And every time I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful that people are choosing to spend their time coming together to support one another. And yeah, that gives me a ton of hope too. So I appreciate you helping me reflect on that. And Dr. Bordere, just thank you so much for sharing all of your insights today with me and with our supporters and our guests today. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you for having me. And thank you for all of the work that you're doing with the Dougy Center, with Grief Out Loud. It makes a difference, and other programs that are available. So keep doing what you're doing, and keep making the experiences of kids across different groups visible, and reassured that their voices count and matter and are valuable.
Well, thank you again. And thank you everyone for tuning in for this conversation today. As I mentioned, Dr. Bordere is a previous guest on Grief Out Loud, so be sure to tune in to our full episode. And if you want to hear more stories like the conversation we had today, you should tune into the full catalog of Grief Out Loud. We have conversations with people who are dealing with grief currently, dealing with grief in a retrospective, and also other professionals like Dr. Bordere. You can find all of our episodes at our website, dougy.org. Here are a few examples from a couple of episodes of Grief Out Loud. It is platitude and cliche-free, we promise.
Death was never like a scary topic to me. It was always known to me that my mother was not going to be here forever.
I definitely remember the night that she told us.
I do believe just sitting in someone's grief is powerful.
The best memory that I have over the course of the cancer was surprisingly at the end.
A lot of times we don't think it's okay to be joyful and grieve.
You know, as a grief coach, I have them put their hand over their heart and just close their eyes and ask themselves, what do I need?